Welcome, everybody. We have another episode of the Learner-Centered Collaborative Podcast. I am your host, Katie Martin, and so excited to have Tom Schimmer with us today to talk about all things assessment and why it matters. Tom is an education author, speaker, and consultant from Vancouver, British Columbia. Our neighbors up north in Canada. He's recognized as a leader and expert in the areas of classroom assessment, sound grading practices, educational leadership, and RTI. He worked as a teacher, school administrator, and at the central office. After 20 years of working in the system, he has decided to support from outside the system, and he is a full-time author, speaker, and consultant. He has 8 books and an amazing podcast and is all over the place. If you don't follow Tom on social, you should, because he's got great little nuggets of wisdom and insight and lots to read about assessment. So we're going to dig in today. So welcome. Glad you're here, Tom.
Oh, so great to join you, Katie. Thanks for the invite. Remember having you on my podcast a couple of years ago, and glad we could reciprocate in this way. So looking forward to our conversation today for sure.
I am definitely excited to turn the tables and learn a lot from you about your assessment practices and how we can shift to more equitable assessment practices. Mm-hmm. So first, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are? How did you, how did you evolve? What are some experiences that led you to be the leader you are today?
Oh, well, it's been a journey. It's been 32 years in education. I started in 1991. I was a high school history teacher by training. And, ironic in a way that I was an incredibly traditional teacher. Everything that I stand for today in assessment, I would have been against in the early part of my career. I was the zero guy, the late penalty guy, the no retesting guy, grade all the homework guy. That was me in the first, in earnest, the first 6 years of my career, but even 7 years after that. So 13 years in total, because I hit not a breaking point. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I hit a point about 6 years into my career where my daughter was born in 1997. And it really caused me to listen to myself through the lens of her. And she's just an infant, but I'm talking to kids and being kind of harsh and realizing that, boy, what if my daughter's teachers say that to her eventually? But I sat in this purgatory, if you will. I call it my assessment purgatory, for 7 years, because I knew I wanted to change, but I didn't know what to do different. I didn't know what to do in terms of how I would evolve. So 2003, 2004 school year was when I kind of hit a breaking point of I had to do something, and I had to figure out, like, what is going on in education that I'm missing as a teacher. So at the time, I was an assistant principal in a middle school. I was teaching 3 out of 6 periods each day. So I was still in the classroom, and I was and I'm a good teacher. I know I'm a good teacher. I've never been the best teacher in any faculty I've ever worked on, but I know I'm a good teacher. And yet there was a small group of students that I just couldn't reach. And so long story short, I looked out into the education landscape in the early 2000s, and my timing could not have been more perfect, because late 90s, early 2000s, we have this renaissance with assessment practices. I head to Portland, Oregon, to a training at the Assessment Training Institute with Rick Stiggins and Jan Chapuis. And as they say, the rest is history. 19 years ago was when I began this journey, and spent, a good amount of time still working in schools, and worked my way through different schools, middle schools, high schools, as we were transforming our grading practices. Spent 2 years at central office. And that coincided with my first book being published in 2011. And I decided to resign from my position and pursue this work full time, and, kind of support, as you said in the intro, support from the outside. And 12 years later, this is the career, and this is where I'm at.
Awesome. And you have supported so much. I'm laughing because I think I knew this connection to Jan Chapuis, but I didn't, when I was teaching in Hawaii, she came out and worked with a lot of our districts, and I still keep my classroom assessment for her 7 strategies, for assessment, next to me on my desk. It's just so powerful, and so such an important mindset shift. But I remember going through those trainings and thinking, everybody has to do this now. Right. Everybody has to learn about this. And that was actually my first consulting job ever. Also, she hired me as a consultant for ATI, way back when, a little bit after And I went to Portland, Oregon, and sat through those 3 days and learned. And
Yeah.
it was a really a powerful learning experience for me.
Yeah,
Uh,
she's a mentor. She's on my Mount Rushmore when it comes to assessment.
yep.
She's definitely someone that I consider a friend, someone who I've learned so much from. And as the expression goes, standing on the shoulders of giants. And Jan is someone that I think has really forged a pathway with assessment, along with Rick and Tom Gusky and others who've really sort of forged this pathway for people like myself and my colleagues, Cassandra, Nicole, et cetera. We are really following in their footsteps and trying to continue the great work that they've done.
Awesome. So, okay, we're talking big here. We're
Okay.
talking people, we're talking, why assessment and how you shifted.
Yeah.
Uh, Tell me a little bit about what is your philosophy on assessment? There's a lot of people who are saying like, oh, assessment matters, but there's a lot of different ways that we think about it. So when
Yeah.
you are getting people to shift practices and talk about your assessment philosophy,
Mhm.
tell me a little bit more about what that is.
Well, it's interesting. I hate to correct the question, but I
Correct
don't
me
talk.
all along.
I don't talk about assessment philosophy because I
Okay.
think that philosophy is code for. I don't have any research to support the opinion I'm about to express.
Okay.
There are principles of assessment. There are principles of measurement, and not to get too technical, but there are things that lead to reliable and valid grades. There are things that we do from formative assessment to effective feedback. There are practices and strategies. Now, what I will say to come back around is there are many places where we get to make implementation choices for sure. But assessment really is something that has fundamental principles that we need to follow and adhere to and this is the most important part, if you want accuracy in assessment, then you have to follow some rules. So often in workshops, I'll look at people with a bit of a smirk on my face and I'll say, listen, if you don't care about accurately reporting student achievement, then do whatever you want in your gradebook. Like do whatever you want with assessment, doesn't matter. But if accuracy matters to you, and I know it does for most teachers,
Yeah.
then you have to follow some rules and principles. So my feeling is that if I were to sum it up, I would say assess because you have to, grade when you need to. And that's sort of an approach that I take if I were to just, one quick sentence. And that means you can't teach without assessment, because if we are going to claim to be developing anything in our students, if we're going to claim they're 21st century thinkers, if we're going to claim they're innovators, if we're going to claim anything about them, we have to be able to substantiate the claim. And that means we have to assess it. Now, sometimes for people, when you hear the word assessment, they equate that with a stapled packet of paper and a test. And we know that that's not the case. So when I say assess, teachers should be assessing their students every single day. Now, I say that in that way because I want to sort of get a reaction out of people. Because when I say assess every day, I don't mean formally and I don't mean quantifying. Every day, a teacher has to know, did my students learn what I was teaching them today? Did they learn what the intention was? And that can be an exit ticket. That can be a conversation. That can be a discussion at the tables where I go, it's one of the most underutilized formative strategies is to get kids talking about their learning and go listen to them and listen to their understandings and their misunderstandings and allow yourself to be instructionally agile. So we need to assess if we're going to teach. Teaching without assessment is information delivery. And we need to teach in order to assess and verify. Now, there are periodic moments where we need to, verify the degree to which students have met a learning goal. And that would be the grading part. So for me, if I were to sum it up, I'd say assess because you have to, grade when you need to. And that to me finds the right balance.
I love that so much. That's going to stick with me because I think so many people get stuck with the grading equals assessment.
Right.
Right? Do you see that? So
Totally.
I see a lot. We're standards based. We're going to go and shift our entire system of grading and assessment. And they say, so that means that you don't have to do, tests every time someone turns something in that doesn't go in the grade book.
Right.
What I end up seeing that translate to in too many situations is they're not giving feedback to students.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's right.
Like we're just saying the summative is the only thing that counts. And so students are practicing or not, and not getting that feedback. Are you
and
seeing
feedback?
that too?
Yeah, totally. Feedback is the key. Unanimous agreement in academia about how you raise achievement, and that is through feedback. So I often say to people in workshops, if you're going to ask me, Tom, can you show me how standards-based grading raises achievement? I'm going to tell you, that's like asking me, how does my bathroom scale help me lose weight? That's what you're asking, because it's not what grading is for. Grading is measurement. Grading is not about raising achievement. It's about accurately determining the level of achievement that has been reached, right? And so you're spot on, Katie, with this idea of feedback. Feedback is how we raise achievement, but feedback is really nuanced and complex. It's not as simple as people make it out to be. The way it gets talked about on social media, it's as if you just provide feedback and you'll have a learning explosion. And there's a lot of times feedback doesn't work. And there's a lot of nuance to feedback, and it's context dependent and all of those things. So I sometimes see things and I have to just sort of, I don't want to respond, or I don't want to, but it's, we oversimplify things. And I think that's social media writ large, but you're right. Feedback is where we're going to raise achievement. And it's through those formative opportunities, not quantifying learning, but looking at what is the quality, what's next for that learner, what is going to take them to the next level of achievement, and how they can continue to grow on that trajectory. That is the key to how we raise achievement.
Yes. And so like when you said, I'm thinking about your intro, when you talked about, I knew I was a great teacher, right?
Yeah.
And that means something to educators. We want to go and feel like we're doing a good job, and we're working really hard to meet the needs of our students. And yet when we're not giving feedback, when we're not having these conversations with students, we aren't actually getting to that full implementation of being a really effective educator who is supporting students to meet their learning targets and goals.
Right. Yeah, that is the key. So you have to ask yourself, what gives me the opportunity to provide? If feedback is the key to achievement, then what gives me the opportunity to give feedback? And that is the gathering of evidence. And that's really what assessment is. Let's not overthink it. Assessment is just the gathering of information about student learning. That in any way, shape, or form, you either prioritize the formative purpose, which is to provide feedback, or you prioritize the summative purpose, which is to verify. But being clear on your purpose of assessment is really critical, because it tells you what to do with the information once you gather it. So when I talk to teachers about homework, for example, and the varying degrees to which teachers still utilize homework, the question about homework is not, should I grade it? Should I not grade it? The question is, what purpose does the homework serve? And if you say, well, I want the kids to practice, I want them to get better at this skill, then you've just described the formative purpose. So just keep grading out of the equation. Right. And if you say, well, this is a research paper or a project that I want them doing from home and bringing it in and all of that, then maybe you've described the summative purpose. So why you want the information is a really important question to ask every time you assess your student. Just ask yourself, why? What purpose does this serve? Why do I want this information? And feedback is the key to raising achievement. The gathering of evidence allows me to give that feedback, and that's why assessment is so critical.
Yeah, and what you're talking about requires a different way of structuring our time with our learners. Right? If I'm really going to be gathering evidence, you are a high school teacher, I was a middle school teacher. I often hear from these teachers, I have 150 to 200 kids. Like there's no way I can give them feedback. Yet we know really effective teachers who are doing that. And if you restructure your time from being the teller of all things and and sharing and spending your 60 minutes to 90 minutes with kids lecturing, and then having them go and do the work, it's really hard to give feedback because everyone's doing the work on their own time.
Yeah, right? So true.
The students are taking the work home. They're mad about it because they have their own lives. The teachers, if they're giving feedback, are taking it all home. And that's really frustrating and a huge burden to take on in addition to their own lives as well. So if we're going to be collecting evidence, then we need to think about how do we get kids doing the work in class and structure opportunities to connect and gather that evidence while we have them in front of us, not when it's 5 weeks later and we're giving the grade in a grade book. That actually has no impact on learners. They don't care when they're getting the feedback 5 weeks later, right?
Yeah, that's so true. The usability of the feedback. There's a couple of things, like honestly, I would say that most teachers are, for all the right reasons, are actually guilty of giving kids too much feedback. And how you measure too much is just ask yourself, how much time am I prepared to give kids to act upon the feedback? So think of this sort of mantra. Any feedback that I provide students that they are not permitted to act upon or given the opportunity to act upon, it's useless feedback. There's no point in giving that feedback. So what I would say to teachers is there's two things that you can do to help mitigate some of the overwhelming feelings of time and all of that. And the first would be to restrict the amount of feedback to what's most pressing. Like if you're feeling overwhelmed and you feel like, oh my gosh, how am I going to give all this feedback? Then just focus on what is most pressing for this learner. So you might identify 12 things that this student needs to improve upon. What are the most pressing 2 things that would really elevate their level of understanding, their depth of demonstration, or whatever it is? So, and whatever you've got time for. So make sure that what you're providing feedback on really does allow them for the time to act upon it. That's a critical part. If you're going to give them more time, maybe there's more pieces. I would also say, as a caveat to that, is to balance strengths and that which needs strengthening, because feedback is most effective when it addresses partial understanding. So there has to be some semblance of correctness. So maybe start with, 3 things they did really well, 2 things they need to work on, and 1 way they can stretch themselves. There's a 3-2-1 protocol right there, or a 2-1-1 or something like that. And the other thing I would say that teachers often do, again, for the right reasons, so it's not a criticism, it's more a critique, right? Is ask yourself this question about your feedback. Is my feedback a set of directions, or does my feedback cause thinking? Because if your feedback is a set of directions, then it's your thinking that they're just executing. They just do what they're told, and it's not really their learning. So think about editing a writing assignment, right? My teacher tells me what to do, and it's not really my writing. So feedback that can come in the form of a cue, a question, a prompt, a highlight, something that triggers them to have to think about their learning again. So you can be a little bit cryptic with feedback, maybe not for novice learners, but for most kids, you can ask them questions, do a prompt, a highlight, something that causes them to do the thinking. So try to limit yourself to what's most pressing and provide feedback that causes thinking, and you will save time. So it's efficient for the teacher, but it's actually very effective for the students. So that's where we have some alignment there.
I love that. It reminds me of, the essays, and I did this early on as a young English teacher. I had my students write their essays, 5-paragraph essay, brought it home, sat down, corrected it all. It took days to grade all of them and give this really descriptive feedback. I thought, man, I am crushing this as a teacher. Look at all this great feedback I'm giving them. I love them so much. I give it back to them. They look at it. They either throw it away, set it down. I didn't give them time to really look at it. There was no expectation to revise it. I had become a better writer in the process because I had been looking at all of this, but they didn't do the work. I was doing it all for them. And even if they did correct it as I had suggested, they weren't doing any thinking. Yeah. They were simply, like you said, copying down what I told them to do. So all of this cognitive load was on my shoulders.
Right. Totally.
And they were simply passively moving along.
Yeah, no. And to stick with the theme here of your podcast and your book, Learner Centered.
Yeah.
When I went to Portland and I had the training with ATI, I remember going to a conference and Rick Stiggins was doing the opening keynote. And I remember sitting there and I was just absorbing it all. And I was just so excited because my mind was being blown about what assessment could be. Sure. And he was on stage, and I will never forget this. And I remember it. I remember what he was wearing. I remember exactly everything, the red sweater vest he had on, the whole thing. And he was so passionate, but he said something that I've never forgotten. And that was this. He said, the person who does the assessing does the learning. And what I started to realize in that moment was that the reason we as educators need to grow our assessment competence or assessment literacy is not so we become the experts. We actually need to become the experts so we can teach the students how to do this for themselves, that they can start to recognize quality, that they can give themselves feedback through self-assessment. We're outnumbered in the classroom. So first of all, from a student perspective, students have access to their thoughts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They always have the opportunity to self-assess. So why would we not try to teach them to do that? And even in a peer assessment situation, we are outnumbered. There's just more of them than there is of us. So why not teach them how to recognize quality, how to give quality feedback? And peer assessment needs a little bit more finesse because there is the social dynamic of how to give feedback to somebody that's productive and all of that. But I've never forgotten that putting the students at the center of the assessment experience. That doesn't mean we back away. I think you would agree that when we talk learner-centered, it's not a zero-sum game. It's bringing the students inside with us and empowering them and enabling them to assess for themselves. We are still the experts in the room. We don't want to dismiss that and diminish that. But students have much to tell each other about quality. And if we can teach them about criteria, help them recognize what's next for me as a learner? What interventions do I need? How am I going to extend myself? What am I curious about? All of that can really come into the process. So for me, that's the end game of helping, of developing yourself as an assessment expert, as a teacher, is so you can put the students at the center of the experience and they can start to do it for themselves.
Yeah, and what you're talking about absolutely sounds around structures and systems in the class for how you can support learners to
For sure.
understand what the goal is. And
Mhm.
I think in addition to feedback, getting really clear about what we are trying to teach
Mhm.
is also very much goes over is missed in many classrooms.
Right.
And I again don't mean that as a people are really busy and we're just moving along, and I don't think that curriculum providers, instructional leaders, PLCs have done a good enough job in many cases helping educators be really clear about what they're teaching. Instead, it's like, here's the lesson, here's the experience, instead of the most effective teachers I've ever been around or seen are really, really finely attuned to what they want their kids to know and do.
Right.
And
That's huge.
yeah, and when you know that and you're clear about that, everything falls in line. The
Mhm.
assessment, the success criteria, your assessment practices, instead of just saying, here's a rubric, here's a deadline,
Mhm.
I'm gonna give you feedback, we're starting to say, then my feedback is really clearly aligned with success. Students
Right.
can give each other feedback, as you said.
Right.
Um, but we miss that a lot.
Mhm. We have to be clear on the learning intentions, and that's one of the things when I work with teachers and they say, Tom, I'm really frustrated that my students don't own their learning or they don't invest in their learning. I'm like, well, do you tell them what the learning is every day? And they some of them, most do, but some of them have a moment where they go, well, maybe I don't. I'm like,
Right.
well, how are they supposed to own something that they're not aware of if you're not telling them what the learning goal is? It doesn't have to be in that traditional, student objectives like we did back in the day. Just show them a math problem and say, by the end of today, you're going to be able to answer this problem, or show them the solution. You're going to know how to do this. Show them what the success criteria would be, not just a rubric, but how do I know that I've learned what I'm being taught today? So there are some prerequisites that you have to think about in terms of, if you're going to bring students inside the process of assessment, we have to make things transparent. So it forces us as educators to tighten up our assessment game if we're going to make this clear to students. And that it's a bigger picture, because my colleagues and I talk about this idea of student investment, and we know that assessment can feed this process of students being more self-regulatory about their learning. It isn't just about assessment. The most common conceptualization of self-regulation of learning is a phase model. Like, the students go through a series of phases, and those phases align perfectly with the assessment cycle. So, for example, when Royce Sadler coined and you look at Jan's book, and the questions that formulated the foundation of Jan's 7 strategies are, where am I going? Where am I now? How do I close the gap? Well, when Sadler posed those questions in 1989, they were about student self-assessment. But if you think about the self-regulation of learning, where you might have a forethought phase, the performance phase, and a reflection phase, the assessment cycle feeds that. So if teachers are wondering, like, how can I get students to be more self-regulatory about their learning, it's actually through assessment. So when I share, where am I going, when I share where they're going, the learning goals, that's the perfect opportunity for students to take inventory on setting goals and what's my plan, and do I have a level of efficacy of, do I believe I can do it? Performance, about monitoring self and metacognitive monitoring of where I'm at in the process. That aligns perfectly with where am I now as I'm self-assessing. And then, how do I close the gap, aligns perfectly with reflection. Am I satisfied? What do I attribute my success? Am I satisfied with how I was during this whole process, and what's my new goal going forward? So it's a bigger picture. It's not just about self-assessment, but assessment can feed the process of being more self-regulatory. But, and I'll just finish with this, because we're teaching kids to be more self-regulatory, their assessment results go up. So assessment and self-regulation have a symbiotic relationship. And that is how we get to, because a lot of teachers are like, I don't know how to get my kids be more invested or to own their learning. Use the assessment cycle to your advantage to help kids set goals, be more metacognitive, and go through that process, and you'll have that result eventually.
I love that. And I think what you said at the beginning around, it is not just students will be able to, that we're writing on our board and we're going
Right.
through the motions, right?
Mhm.
But if we don't help kids know where they're going, how in the
Mhm.
world? So the examples, I love that. Here's an example of what I want you to be able to do. Too often, and I did this again as an early teacher, it was like a mystery to kids, right? What they were learning. And I knew all the information of where I wanted them to go, but it was a mystery to them until you kind of pull back the curtain and invite them in that, hey, you're part of this process too. Then we get to what you said, they can be more involved in that process. They can be at the center of it instead of just blindly following the lessons and filling in the worksheets.
Yeah.
Maybe I got it, maybe I didn't. They are much more invested when they see what success looks like.
Yeah, this is part of, you're making me think of a dialogue I've had several times. I wouldn't say this is the majority, but I hear people occasionally saying, Tom, I don't really like to use rubrics because they kind of box kids in and they restrict their creativity. And I bristle at that because, first of all, that's a rubric that's built poorly. If your rubric is prescribing what the students are supposed to do, then that's not a rubric. That's a set of directions. Your rubric should describe quality, and it's up to the student to manifest that, right? So I could tell the students what to do, or I could describe a certain quality that the students have freedom. So I could, for example, just a really simple example, I could say, it'd be really cool if you started your narrative with an accident or a flashback or something. Well, that's telling the student what to do. Of course, that restricts their creativity. But if I said, you need to find a way to grab the reader's attention right at the beginning of your narrative, then it's their freedom to choose. So it's just that little tweak. So to me, keeping criteria hidden, keeping it cryptic and letting them meander, to me, rubrics are hard. And so I do understand that sometimes that's a great way of getting out of making a rubric because they're not fun. Nobody likes making them. Anybody who says they like making rubrics is not telling the truth.
No.
But they're so critical because I think of rubrics as a teaching tool that you use for assessment. It's not just an assessment tool. It's something that should show up right at the beginning of the unit with exemplars to say, this is where we're going. And I want you to critique someone else's example so you get a sense of what quality looks like. So that level of transparency, I think, is, if you're going to have students at the center of this experience, you have to be fully transparent with them. Otherwise, it's a bit of smoke and mirrors, and it's not really going to take hold the way we'd want it to.
Yeah. And I think that there's nuance in what you're talking about. I wholeheartedly agree. The transparency. Here's where we're going. This is a model. I use models all the time. You're a writer. Like I look at other people's work. I read other books. I watch other, listen to other podcasts. Those models for me are helpful to see, what do I like? What do I not like? How do I need to improve my own practice? And a lot of times when we don't provide those models, or people think it's cheating, right? That's what I've heard. It's cheating if I show kids a model, they're just going to copy it. Well, if they're just copying it, there's no freedom and flexibility. They're not getting feedback through the process. They're not learning and growing. And I think there's a very, there's a huge disconnect between I show a model, kids copy it, and then I grade that they actually completed the assignment. That's completion, right? Yeah. Here's what it is. Copy what I put up on the board. Make sure you fill in your worksheet, or you write the paper, and I check it off. You did it. Yeah. That is simply completion. You're showing up. That is not actually evidence of learning. Flipping that, I tell you where we're going. I show you models. I give you a chance to actually practice on your own and give you feedback and guidance along the way, rough drafts and all of that. And then we grade the final product after we've collected all that data and assessed. That's a very different experience where learners are owning it and doing something as a result.
Yeah. It's totally different. And, it's always interesting to me that, and again, we are talking about a small minority of people here, so I don't want to go over the top, but it's always interesting to me that if this is what my new favorite question to ask people when they consider their assessment practices is this: if that were being done to you in your professional life rather than by you, would you still be okay with that? So imagine a teacher performance appraisal being done by the principal, and the principal says, well, I don't want to give away the answers, so you just teach and I'll watch and I'll let you know how you're doing. You would not be comfortable with that. You would want to know what the criteria was, and you would want to know what the scale was, or how you were being judged, or anything like that level of transparency, right? When people talk about exceeds expectations as a grading level, it's like, would you be okay with that if I came back to you and said, you're a good teacher, and you'd say, well, why am I not a 4 as a teacher? You're a 3. Why am I a 3? And I said, well, well, you didn't wow me. You didn't go above and beyond your job. You just you're a good teacher. Don't worry. You should be happy with that. No one comes out of that feeling good and feeling inspired. So I think there's times where we can be guilty of talking out of both sides of our mouths, where what's good for us wouldn't be good for kids. And I don't know why we do that to students. I mean, be fully transparent with where they're going. If you want them to own their learning, if you want them invested in their learning, if you want them to be truly learner-centered, then we have to put them at the center and give them full transparency with all of that.
Oh, I love that. So you just hit on something that I want to kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
The 4, exceeds expectations. So I really struggle with this.
Yeah.
And I want to get your take on it. So
okay.
A lot of times I see, we have this narrow standard, we're focusing on that, and then we're spending a lot of time, whether it's the rubric or grading students on the 1 to 4. So 1, low level, 2, you're almost there, but we're really detailing that. 3 is proficiency, and then 4 exceeds expectations.
Yeah.
And so 1, just the exceeds expectations, I struggle with, because people are like, oh, you have to apply something. That's when you actually exceed expectation. And I don't see it that way, because to learn, we need to be applying, we need to be doing something to actually get excited. And so sometimes the kids who struggle the most never get the opportunity to do things that actually would make it a 4 level. So there's one part that I really struggle with. Mm-hmm. So, and then there's another, but I want to get your take on that. What is
there's a lot of layers to it. When I work with schools, I'll ask them 2 questions in succession, right? So I'll go to a school, I'm thinking, and again, it's a minority of schools, but I go to a school and I say, how many levels do you have? And they'll say, we have 4. And I say, okay, how many accessible and acceptable levels do you have? I say, let's talk about your 1. What is your 1? They say, well, our 1 is not yet. Okay, so that's not an acceptable level of performance. What about your 4? Well, that's above and beyond or exceeds the expectation. I said, that's not accessible to most learners. So now you're really only dealing with 2 levels, not 4. And then you're going to come back and tell me, oh, Tom, this 3 category is so broad because we have the high 3s and the low 3s and all of this stuff. And that's because you've squeezed both ends of your scale. Exceeds the expectation is problematic because it's rarely ever defined clearly. And you'll always get a bias from me, which is transparency and clarity with students. So if you were to ask me, hey, Tom, how tall are you? And I just said to you, well, I'm taller than 5'10". Like, there's no clarity. Like, you don't know how tall I am. You just know I'm taller than 5'10". So I'm more than that is not clear enough and not specific enough. So I think of the 4 not as exceeds, but I think of the 4 as a level of excellence. It's a level of refinement. So when I look at a rubric, I would tell people there's nothing wrong with the 3 or the 4. The 3 is competent. It's good. There's nothing wrong with it. The 4 is refined. It's deep. It's more sophisticated. It's more creative, whatever the context is. Right. So you can write in a clinical fashion and put together a really good writing piece, and that would be a 3, a proficient piece. But if you found a creative way to introduce your argument, if you've got some really interesting examples or your transitions are unique, that's a 4. There's refinement and excellence. And this is the key for me, Katie. You teach to the 4. I don't know why we wouldn't teach to excellence. Now, if students fall short of that, then they know why, and it's clear and transparent to them. So for me, exceeds is problematic. It rarely gets defined. It also, and this is what I usually lead with, I ask people, what is a report card grade supposed to communicate? And every single person comes back with the same answer, basically, which is that a report card grade is supposed to communicate the student's ability to meet the standards of the class that they're enrolled in. I say, so then how can you have a level that says they now have to go above and beyond? Because you just told me the grade is supposed to be about the standards, and now you're saying they have to go above and beyond. So it's a bit of a bait and switch on kids, and at best, it's opaque, and at worst, it's dishonest. It's not transparent to kids. So the 4 for me should be a level of excellence. And so I would say that each level is a version of meeting the standards. I'm meeting the standard at a novice level, therefore I'm a 1. I'm meeting the standard at a developing level. That's a 2. I'm meeting the standard at a proficient level. That's 3. I'm meeting the standard at an exemplary or a level of excellence. That's the 4. So what happens, and I'll just finish with this and we'll get to the next question. The reason exceeds becomes an issue in a lot of schools is because what schools are trying to do is they're trying to scale a binary standard. They're trying to take a standard that is a yes, no, right, wrong, can, can't. And then they think to themselves, well, if 3 means they've got it, how can you have more than got it? I'll give you an example. 11 plus 12 is not scalable, right? There's one answer to the question. So if we say that the 3 is I can add 11 plus 12, then what is the 4? Well, you have to go above and beyond, unless you look at binary standards and you rate them on frequency. So what I would do with 11 plus 12 is I would redefine my 4 through 1 to be a frequency scale. So you zoom out. I can't scale 11 plus 12, but what I can scale is the consistency with which a student can add two-digit numbers. Can they, going from 4 to 1, can they consistently, usually, sometimes, or rarely add two-digit numbers? So when you look at a standard, ask yourself, is this standard scalable? If the answer is yes, that's because you can envision several gradations of quality. If the answer is no, then scale it through frequency, and that way you can keep your levels the same and not have to go to that exceeds piece. All right.
All right.
Lots
So
to say about that, Katie.
yeah, no, I'm in agreement, and I have some clarification questions. So one, I fundamentally don't understand why we need a 1 to 4. I believe we have a 1 to 4 because we are trying to recreate an A through F system minus the F.
Yeah,
And
maybe.
it feels to me that we are making up why we need a 1 to 4.
Yeah.
So that it can equate to A, B, C, D, which we're saying it shouldn't.
Yeah.
Right. We're saying we're now going to numbers because A through F is not equitable, whatever reasons. Yet we just replace the numbers, and in in some systems, we're not doing A to F, we're doing 1 to 4, and then actually reporting on it as an A to F scale. And I think it is really doing a disservice to grading and assessment practices that are trying to shift.
Yeah.
And we're making it up.
Well, partially for sure. Let me get into some of the nuances about this. Okay, A through F is not the issue. A through F and 1 through 4 or 0 through 4 are both 5 levels. It's the percentage scale that's the problem. So when people equate letter grades with percentages, that's the problem. I could say, what is an A? An A means a student has reached an exemplary level of understanding, just like a 4. So those symbols that we use, whether you use letters of the alphabet, numbers, or descriptors, like I am completely agnostic to that. I think it's such a low yield change that if a high school said, we're going to keep A through F because we have transcripts to produce and we've got athletic eligibility to deal with. That's fine. Redefine what the A means. Talk about the A not as 90 to 100, but talk about the A as a level of excellence. Talk about the B as proficient. Talk about the C as developing. Talk about the D as a novice, and talk about the F as the insufficient evidence. So you could redefine those levels. The rule basically is that, and there is no real definitive rule, the research has made it clear that fewer, more clearly distinguishable or discernible levels is more reliable than a 0 to 100 scale. When you have a 0 to 100 scale, you have two problems. One is if it's a right, wrong, yes, no binary standard, the scores don't account for the type of error that the student made. So if two students scored a 15 out of 20, one student could have answered 15 questions, left 5 blank, had no idea how to answer them, but the other student may have answered all 20 questions, known what to do, but made 5 simple mistakes. They'll both get a 75. So the best case scenario with percentages is you get an incomplete view of the learner because you don't account for the type of error. Now, on the flip side, when you're making an indirect scoring inference, so I'm reading an essay, judging its quality, and giving it a 0 to 100 score, the margin of error is around plus or minus 5 to 6 points. So 10 to 12 point window. And that study has been replicated for over 100 years. So the answer was to base grades on fewer, more clearly discernible levels and base grades on clearly articulated success criteria. So what is a tool that we use in education that has fewer levels and clearly articulates success criteria? We call that a rubric. So when I work with schools, I remind them that this stuff didn't just fall out of the sky. But here's the key. There is no definitiveness with how many levels. So if a school wanted to have 3 levels, that would be okay. If you wanted to have pass fail, you could do that too. You could have 5 levels. You can have as many levels as you want, as long as you can clearly describe the difference between them. So I think you're right in the sense that I think schools are trying to take some of the constructs of the traditional system, like the A through F, and convert it to a standards-based system, which I've seen schools do very well, and I've seen schools do very poorly. You know, one thing about that, Katie, is I often say to schools, be careful, because one fast way to cause your parent community to implode is to change your symbols without helping them understand what you're doing. So you could keep your report card the same. This is why I often talk about a standards-based mindset, because you could keep your report card the same. You could keep the A through F, but you change the engine that produces those grades. And so the optics of the report card may never change, but the assessment practices that produce the grades are what really matter. And for me, that's my bias. I'd rather you spend time looking at more recent evidence. I'd rather you bring kids inside the process, change the assessment practices that produce grades, and you'll get a bigger bang for your buck than just changing the symbols and thinking, oh, now we're standards-based. You're not if your practices aren't standards-based. It's not your symbols, it's what you do in the classroom every day.
Oh, we might have to do a part 2 on this, because because then you absolutely. Yeah. And when you shift and teachers use different systems.
Yeah.
How are that? So that's what I'm curious to is how are parents supposed to understand when teachers aren't using the same levels, right? Some are still using percentages, some are still using 1 to 4. Mm-hmm. And when I talk to parents, I'm not hearing, oh, I don't want them to shift practices. When they hear about the mindset, it makes sense to them. Yeah. But when you shift to a 1 to 4, and you don't, as we talked about in the beginning, have clear criteria, give feedback, you are not inherently doing anything better for students by numbering at a 1 to 4 when you're not actually changing the learning and changing the structure of what's happening in class. Are we on the same page there?
Spot on for that. I just honestly, I see too many schools spending too much time debating, are we going to use letters? Are we going to use numbers? Are we going to use descriptors? That should take 5 minutes. The rest of it is what we need to talk about. The symbols are just symbols. And I'm not saying a symbol is the most descriptive, but if we're on the same page about what a symbol means, you can actually get some good information. And I always use this example. If you were driving anywhere in the world, and whether you spoke the language or not, I don't know why you would drive, but just work with me on this example. You're driving anywhere in the world, Katie, and you came across a red octagon. Would you know what to do?
Yes.
You'd know what to do. And how much information would start coming into your head about how to proceed, right? So I'm not saying a symbol is the most descriptive, but let's not pretend. And let's not pretend that you can't get information from a symbol. But the reason that works is because everyone in the world agrees a red octagon means stop. Now, imagine if half the world thought a red octagon meant yield. Suddenly we have an issue. If a third of the world thought the red octagon meant go, a third of the world thought, accelerate, a third of the world thought yield, and a third thought stop, we'd have complete chaos on the roads. And that's what's happened with grades. It's the definition. Yeah. It's everybody has their own definition of what an A or a 4 or an exceeds is, and we have no clarity.
Yes.
And so therefore we can't interpret, and this is reliability. If you don't have reliability with how grades are determined, so this gets technical here, but if 2 or more teachers teaching the same grade level subject don't determine grades in a similar and like-minded fashion, their grades are not reliable. And in the workaround measurement, if you don't have reliability, you can't make a valid interpretation of the results. Validity and reliability actually work backwards. You need, no assessment is ever valid or invalid. You only either have a reliable measure or an unreliable measure. And if you have a reliable measure, then you can make a valid interpretation of the results. But if everyone in a school district, for example, in the 10th grade got a B in science, but every teacher determined their grades in a different manner, those Bs would be meaningless. We would not be able to interpret those Bs to mean anything. But if we knew every teacher used clear criteria and with sound assessment practices, then we would be able to take some information. Again, I want to be clear, a single symbol is not the most descriptive way. However, you and I both know if we came across a red octagon, there would be sentences worth of information that would come into our head because there's universal agreement as to what that symbol means.
So for people listening going, oh my gosh, we don't have clarity. Oh my gosh, no wonder this is frustrating.
Yeah.
Some next steps seem to be, that's why it matters so much in your PLCs, in your school teams, in your, the whole grade level, being really clear about what it is, just like we started with the teacher, being really clear what we want students to know and do, really clear about what that success looks like. And then that's where you get the autonomy, flexibility, personalization in the classroom, because the team is working really hard with the students at the center to help them reach that criteria so then they can report on it, right?
Right. Yes. There's many pathways to reach proficiency with a standard. Having standards, this is a debate I've had with many people, is that standards and standardization are not the same thing.
Yeah.
Having a destination doesn't mean we all have to get there along the same pathway. So the personalization comes with how I learn. The personalization comes with my feedback. It comes with how I give myself feedback. It comes with what I'm curious about. It comes with all of those innovative practices that I know you are all about. And we can all reach the same destination. Having a standard, a level of excellence, doesn't mean that everybody has to get there the same way. So I think conflating standards and standardization is a mistake. I don't agree with that. It's not the same thing. It doesn't mean we all have to teach the same way. Teachers have total autonomy over pedagogy. And they have some autonomy over curriculum, especially if it's a skill-based standard where you can decide what are we reading or what are we arguing about or what are we, all of that. We don't have a lot of autonomy over standards, but that's just the end. That's just the destination. We can get there, get them there in a lot of different ways. And the students can come inside that process and also have some agency around how they get there as well. So to me, it's a false dichotomy, and it's it's just a distraction from what really could be a meaningful, kind of interesting and just complex pathway that kids can take toward their learning.
Love it. We're going to wrap us up there and get us to some, because there's so many different rabbit holes we could go on.
For sure.
But I want to get to rapid fire to close us
All right.
up, and then we can share where everyone can find you. So,
okay.
What is one thing that we should stop doing in education?
Oversimplifying concepts that are complex and nuanced. Yeah, like assessment. Stop talking about assessment as if it's some simple, anyways, rapid fire, so I better stop. But yeah, oversimplifying concepts that take nuance and context.
Great. What should we start doing?
We should start using assessment to drive learning more on a day-to-day basis and start bringing students inside that process so they have agency and guide their own pathway forward.
Love it. What should we keep doing?
We should keep learning. Nobody has this job mastered. We got to keep, I learn stuff every week from people, what I read, my own podcast interviews. We need to keep learning as teachers. If we want to develop lifelong learners, we need to be lifelong learners.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, what are you focusing on or learning right now in your own work or world?
Oh, there's a lot going on right now. Focusing on writing. And I've got a new book coming out in April called Redefining Student Accountability, which is all about how we stop holding kids accountable in the grade book and how we actually teach them the things we're professing to be teaching them instead of punitive measures, and learning about, just continuing to learn about the impact that assessment has in the formative realm. So just ways that we can create different iterations. Writing a book with one of our associates, Natalie Vardabasso. We're writing a book on using story and how we can rehumanize assessment through story structures and all of that. So it's an exciting time for me, for sure. Yeah.
Sounds like it. I can't wait to read both of those. Great. What's one thing that many people might not know about you?
Oh, that's what's one thing they might, that's a good one. I don't know. I played football at Boise State University. How about that?
That's a good, I didn't know about that. That's cool.
Yeah.
This might not be super rapid fire, but do you have a favorite quote or saying or something that comes to mind?
Yeah, I have two. Can I give two?
Sure.
Okay. One of them is, this was my leadership expression: experience comes from poor judgment. And so whenever you make a mistake, you just learn from it. And that's how you gain, experience. And experience comes from the mistakes we make and the lessons we learn and some of the successes we have as well. But that's one. And then the other one would be ignorance on fire is better than knowledge on ice. This is a learn by doing. Teachers make good decisions where kids are concerned. Teachers worry about making mistakes, but teacher mistakes are still good. Teachers don't make harmful decisions to kids. I mean, occasionally, sure, but the vast majority of teachers make good decisions. So just learn by doing, try things, learn from it, and just continue to grow. So for me, I don't mean implement something you know nothing about, but I love that idea of just go for it and try it and then learn from it.
I love that. I always say I would much rather have to pull you back because
Yeah.
you are so excited and on fire than have to push you forward.
Right.
So
Yeah,
yeah, I
totally.
love that. What's one thing that you're grateful for right now?
Oh, I'm grateful for the experiences I have in the work that I do. I never take them for granted. Starting to post COVID get back to some of the overseas work and working with schools, international schools, and just the opportunities I have every week. I am grateful that people think I have something to say and that they come out of it feeling enhanced and rewarded and just honored. So to me, I don't take this work for granted, and I'm just grateful for the opportunities that I have.
Awesome. What is your hope for the future of education? One hope, if you could sum it up.
I the hope for the future of education is that we start. I think if we could, I still think we underserve like kids being at the center of the experience and guiding them and helping them maximize their potential and become, creative and be those lifelong learners. And I think the future of education is having students develop competencies that allow them to be, I know these sound a little bit like buzzwords, but these critical 21st century competencies are what make us adaptable. And the pace of change in society requires adaptability. And I think the future of education is how do we help our students become adaptable in a society that's constantly changing?
Awesome. Well, this has been very informative, helpful. You've helped me solidify some things and you've actually pushed my thinking and I want to go deeper on some more. So I couldn't ask for anything more in a podcast, and just grateful that you joined me in the work that you're doing. We look forward to your books that are coming out in addition to the 8 you already have. Where can people find you if they want to
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. I mean, this has been great, and I would love any time to part two it if you want to. I'd be happy to do
Definitely.
that. I'm on a lot of social media, and the main places you can find me on Twitter at Tom Schimmer and at Tom Schimmer Pod. So I have a podcast, as you mentioned, called the Tom Schimmer Podcast, and you were a guest on it very early on. And so there, I'm on Instagram, Tom Schimmer Podcast on Instagram, also on TikTok. But again, it's not me doing silly lip syncs and dances. It's just clips from the podcast. And that's the place. So the socials are there. The podcast is there for people if they want to, on Apple or Spotify or whatever. It's episode 97 is the latest one. And so approaching the 100th episode, which I'm excited about and looking forward to that. So all over social media and the podcast as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We have definitely enjoyed learning from you today.
Thank you, Katie. It was a pleasure to join you.